Hello, listeners. This is NGO Soul+Strategy. And I'm Tosca. I have thought for a while that while the sector is undergoing change, once again, on several fronts, changes in programming approaches, shifting authority and decision rights to the place of program impact, representation, business models, operating models, etc. What seems to be getting less attention, to my surprise, is whether the organization should go through a fundamental role shift. And common sense, as well as most organizational development people like myself, would say that role and function, as well as strategy, should come before the other types of changes that I just mentioned. One organization that has been advocating that NGOs need to tackle this fundamental question of such a role shift, in other words, the question, what roles are still appropriate, especially for Global North-founded NGOs, is Peace Direct, with Dylan Mathews as its leader. Peace Direct has been pushing out various pieces of thought leadership about this question of what roles are still appropriate and legitimate for Global North-founded INGOs at this point in the history of civil society. So I was keen to have Dylan on the show, and we finally made it. Dylan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tosca. It's really great to be here.
I am so interested to listen to what you will have to say. So Dylan, listeners, is Executive Director of Peace Direct since 2015. He has been also Director of International Programs at YCare International. He was a program manager in his past at CARE, and he worked in a couple of capacities on conflict countries and conflict issues with Landmine Action, Oxford Research Group, and the British Red Cross. Dylan, an obvious first question to ask to kind of orientate ourselves is, what does Peace Direct do programmatically, and why does it exist?
Thanks, Tosca. Good question to start off with. So Peace Direct is a UK-based INGO. We were founded around 20 years ago, and our sort of founding ethos was to support locally led peace-building efforts. So from our very founding, we believed that locally led efforts were the most cost-effective and the most sustainable. And so rather than adopt the usual INGO model, where you would set up a country office, you would then have your expat staff, and you'd create your country strategies, we said, we are just going to identify interesting, promising local organizations working on the front lines of conflict and provide whatever support they need. So that's been really the spirit and the ethos of the organization ever since we were founded over 20 years ago. Since then, we've evolved as an organization. So although we're very much a peace-building organization, we are looking at the dysfunctions in the overall system. And by the system, I don't just mean a peace-building system. I mean the system in which peace-building, humanitarian, and development efforts operate. Because what we have really been, I suppose, really seized with is this problem where local peace builders, local actors just don't get the recognition they need and the support they need. So we've started to look at the overall system. So a lot of the advocacy work that we do and a lot of the research that we do actually extends beyond peace building to look at what we talk about dysfunctions in the system of international cooperation. Why is it that the system is structured in that way or is orientated in that way? And that's led us to do some very interesting pieces of research around structural racism, for example, the need to decolonize the sector, as well as the roles of INGOs. And so that's become a very prominent part of our work, whilst retaining that very strong focus on still being an activist organization that supports local peace builders in 14 countries around the world. But our idea is, if we really want to help peace builders everywhere, then we have to help shift the system in favor of local efforts everywhere, whether they're local peace-building efforts or development efforts or humanitarian efforts.
Got it. Yeah, and I was going to mention in my next question, but you've already done that, so that's great. That you meaning Peace Direct has several other publications around transforming partnerships. You mentioned race, power, and peace building, time to decolonize aid, etc. So in my limited view on the sector, meaning I can't track what everybody's doing all the time, right? It seems that Peace Direct has been very active in the last 5 years or so, and maybe even before that I wasn't aware of, in terms of putting out thought pieces and being active in sessions, etc., to kind of what I would call prod the sector on a couple of fronts. In this interview, I really want to focus on this one piece that got my attention, that is the 9 roles that intermediaries can play in international cooperation. And we'll link to that in the show notes. Listeners, January 2023 is when it came out. So how did it come to be, Dylan, that Peace Direct felt the need to start prodding the sector about the kinds of about this role question? Why did you as an organization start to do that?
Well, the first reason, Tosca, is as you just described it. People aren't talking about the changing and evolving roles of INGOs, and we felt that that was a real problem, a real impediment to the transformation that we think is necessary in the sector. But if I just go back a few steps, a few moments, this really evolved from our analysis of the dysfunctions in the sector. The dysfunctions in the wider system. So I mentioned to you earlier that we, our first deep exploration around the dysfunctions of the sector was in 2020, when we looked at structural racism. We held a global consultation with activists from over 50 countries, about 160 participants, and asked them the question: how do we show up? We, the global north, show up in your spaces. How do you experience us, global north practitioners and actors and policymakers? And we had this sense that there were problems sitting underneath the sector that weren't being talked about. And we were really shocked at what we heard in terms of the strength of feeling that there was amongst global south actors that the system just doesn't work for them. And that a lot of that is based on neo-colonial attitudes around the superiority of the global north knowledge and our expertise. And so it really started from that exploration. And from that, we started to then look at, well, what are these problems? Let's surface some of these problems around, our own expertise, our own knowledge, our own attitudes around, how we see others, how we view global south communities and global south experts or expertise and knowledge. And when looking at that, we heard time and time again from global south actors the same refrain, which was, you INGOs think you know best, and you continue to do the work that we do. You think you have a monopoly on the knowledge. You are self-appointed experts in other people's lives. Why do you think that you should continue to do the work that we could be doing? And that really, I suppose, sort of lit a fire within us. It sort of sparked some ideas. Well, okay, so we are being told time and time again that the global north has dominated the international development, humanitarian, and peace building sector. That our approach has fundamentally disempowered and diminished the agency of local actors. That's what we're hearing. And part of that is because the sector has evolved to such an extent that INGOs have developed a very, very cozy relationship with global north donors, who still represent the largest single source of funding for overseas efforts. And so those roles have been absolutely entrenched. So the INGOs work with the policymakers and the donors, and they become the implementers. And even if they're not the implementers, they become the conduits of funding. They become the grant managers. And that in itself has become part of the problem. So the way I describe it to many people is, in our desire to help, and it is a genuine desire to help, I think, a desire to do good, we've done harm. We've actually entrenched our roles. So we decided to unpick this a little and say, okay, we're now hearing this critique, the critique about our knowledge, the critique about our expertise, the critique about our attitudes, all of these sort of neo-colonial framing of the whole sector. And that's led to a very small number of roles that INGOs see for themselves. And one of them is, we are the expertise, we have the expertise to do the work ourselves, and we will just find implementing partners. Or you can trust us with our money, and we will, with the money, and we will find implementing partners, and we will be the grant managers. And we reflected on that, and and looked at our own role over the last 20 years. And we said, but if those are really the only two roles that the INGO sector can see for itself, then we are doomed. We are doomed because the sector is not going to transform itself, because we are an impediment to that transformation, because we cannot see another alternative role for us. In a sense, it's a failure of imagination. So we did our own piece of internal reflection, and that's what led to that report. We reflected ourselves on the roles that we've played, and we talked to our partners. We talked, internally about the roles that, we have played consistently over the last 20 years, as well as some that are fairly new. And what, to our surprise, there were 9, I think, very strong roles for INGOs.
Yes.
And we don't have country offices, we don't have expat staff, we don't implement programs, and we never have done. And yet we are a functioning INGO that we hope is helping, to support really good work around the world. So I think Peace Direct's existence and its own model, its operating model, is an example of how INGOs could be. But what we wanted to do was dissect that a little.
Yes, and we're going to go in a moment, kind of blow by blow a little bit into each of those 9 roles. But just I want you to repeat, because you were talking quite fast about what you as an organization, Peace Direct, do not have that some other NGOs still have. And you said we do not have country offices. We do not have, what else did you say that Peace Direct?
We don't have any expat staff. We do not parachute folks in. We do not have country strategies. Now, that feels for a lot of INGOs as sort of heresy. So, why don't you have country offices? I remember when I first joined Peace Direct in 2015, we were talking to some donors, and one donor, who will remain nameless, said to me, we can't fund you because you don't have a country office in Eastern Congo. They said to us, if you have a country office in Eastern Congo, then you can talk to our people and we can talk to your people, and then we can agree a grant. And I said, that's not the type of organization we are. And they couldn't understand it. They couldn't compute that an organization could be effective and functioning if they didn't have a country presence. And I've talked a lot about and written about this, Tosca, around the country office structure as being a significant problem.
That would be good if you could please. We'll put that in the show notes if you would be so kind to send that to me.
Sure.
Because that's, for instance, a piece that I haven't seen, and I'd love also for our listeners to see that as well. Okay, so that was a powerful first step into this interview. So let's talk about the 9 roles that intermediaries can play in international collaboration. So for our listeners, I'll just repeat them briefly, and then I'll ask you, Dylan, to say a couple of sentences about each of those roles. 1, interpreter; 2, knowledge broker and producer; 3, trainer and coach and co-learner; 4, convener; 5, connector and ecosystem builder; 6, advocate and amplifier; 7, watchdog; 8, critical friend, which we hear a lot; and 9, sidekick. So, interpreter, tell me, what does that look like?
So we started off with interpreter because we think language matters and the way in which we communicate to each other matters. And by interpreter, we are not talking specifically about language so for example, translating French documents into English, although that is part of it, but it's a smaller part of it. What we're talking about is the fact that if you look at knowledge generation itself, who generates the knowledge? Most of it is global North actors producing documents that are almost incomprehensible to most people outside the sector, and certainly not written for a global South audience. So what you have is UN documents, UN resolutions, you have think tanks producing literature and knowledge on other countries, and yet that literature is not particularly accessible, partly because it's written in English, but partly because it's also absolutely laden with jargon. So how do we, as intermediaries, as global North actors, identify those documents and actually make it accessible to our partners? Okay. So it might be a commitment, a funding commitment that a donor has made. Let's make those documents accessible, and let's also translate them into multiple languages. So with Time to Decolonize Aid, we translated it into 13 languages, which is quite uncommon for most global North organizations. So the role of interpreter can be a simple role in just identifying the knowledge that you think matters and making sure it gets to the people who need it the most. And in doing so, also helping sort of interpret what is being said here through the jargon and cutting through the jargon. And look, let's be honest, Tosca, I mean, you've been in the sector a while, so same as me. We are riddled with jargon. The amount of jargon that we have in our world makes it very, very difficult for a lot of people to make sense of it.
Yeah, clear. Knowledge broker and producer, that role has been talked about for about 5 to 8 years or so. What does that look like in your role?
Well, the easy part is the knowledge producer. We all have knowledge. We're all generating knowledge through our own practice. And we also say we shouldn't deny that. So if we as an organization are learning things, we should produce some knowledge on that and share that. We do, however, have a health warning against some of these, because the dominance in the sector of global north production of knowledge means that it really does leave very little space for global south actors and think tanks to produce knowledge. And I talk about this as being a sort of a rather virtuous cycle of the production and consumption of knowledge in the global north. You know, global north actors producing knowledge about Somalia or Sudan or Sri Lanka for global north actors. And so we've got to make sure when we are talking about production knowledge that we don't reinforce the existing sort of power imbalances. But I'd like to talk about knowledge broker. Knowledge broker is, I think, more important because what we have seen is that there is a vast, and we all know this, there's a vast wealth of knowledge out there. And I don't mean the knowledge in, for example, global north institutions. I'm talking about the knowledge in one community or one context that another context could use. Actually, when we talk to our partners, most of them say the same thing. And we have local partners in 14 countries. They say we don't have the time. We are fighting for our own survival. We don't have the infrastructure. They don't have stable internet connections. And they're living hand to mouth in terms of the work that they do.
Yeah.
What can we do? We can help identify knowledge that can support them. And I'll give you a very quick practical example. A partner of ours in one country wanted to think about election monitoring and wanted to think about early warning networks. So rather than us holding ourselves up as the experts, we don't call ourselves the experts, we looked at other early warning networks from around the world, and we found one on the same continent, but from a different country, and we connected them. That expertise, then they flew to that other country, and they had a workshop together. So sometimes us being a knowledge broker just means recognizing that we don't have to have the answers. We just need to be able to do some homework on behalf of our partners and build the bridges between the sources of knowledge generation. And that's where the knowledge brokering is really, really important.
Yeah, clear. Trainer, coach, and co-learner. I'm interested in intricacies of trainer and coach so that global north knowledge is not once again privileged as the only source, right? Or the best source, right? Talk to me about that nuance within this role.
So we have a health warning about the trainer and the coach, because absolutely, as you say, at the moment, the sector currently revolves around this notion that global north organizations hold the expertise. So we've got to be very careful when we think about the trainer and the coach that we don't fall into that same trap. At the same time, our partners have said to us, Peace Direct, you have some skills that we'd love to learn from. So, for example, your skills in advocacy, your skills in fundraising from the general public. So one of our partners in Zimbabwe wanted to know how to raise funds from the general public. So we've been doing that for 20 years. So we've been working with them as, you know, to coach them, to teach them how to do that. But we are very, very mindful of not overstepping the boundaries and saying that we suddenly know about their context, or we suddenly know about a technical piece of work in peace building, for example. You know, it's really about understanding what roles and added value we have as a trainer and a coach, and where sometimes we just might want to be a knowledge broker.
Yes.
Co-learner, by the way, Tosca, I think is really, really important, because most organizations don't consider themselves in a co-learning relationship.
You mean they think they have nothing to learn?
They think that the learning tends to go one way. So that, you know, when they might have something to learn, but let's say that global north organization thinks that they might learn from other global north organizations rather than learning from the partner that they are supporting. It tends to be a one-way relationship where the INGO says we have the expertise in reporting or fundraising or whatever it might be, and actually we can't learn from our partner. So what we at Peace Direct try to do is we try to talk about in our strategic partnership agreements that we're going to learn together.
Yeah, and
And
that
we're
is
going to
bi-directional.
Exactly.
Yes.
And that is really, really important because it then resets the kind of relationship, because we start to think from a place of humility around exactly what we need to learn and what the blind spots are for us as an organization.
Yeah, I'm very much tempted, but we're not going to do that, is to bridge over to the leader as learner, which I think is incredibly important skill these days. But okay, convener is kind of clear, I think. Anything's meaning it's language that we have tossed around for a while now. What is Peace Direct's take on that?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say about convener is that we know that we could use our convening power more. I think most organizations tend to work only with their partners, right? So they don't think about how to convene other actors together, both virtually and in country. And if they do, the other thing that we tend to see is that they come with an agenda. So they say, right, we're going to convene you for the purposes of exploring a particular issue. It's very rare that you find organizations that say, we're going to convene for the sole purpose of helping you strengthen the networks that you might have. And so for Peace Direct, we've organized things called peace exchanges for many years, where we will invite our partners, but we will also ask our partners to invite others. And they will then convene and they will set the agenda. And again, that's a bit of unlearning that I think INGOs need to do, because we tend to say, if we're going to convene, we have to set the agenda or co-develop the agenda. Actually, sometimes you can just create the space and step away and allow the co-creation to be without you it being in the room. So convening is really, really important. And we've heard from our partners, it's like gold dust for them, because they don't often have the time to reflect and strategize together, because they're just living hand to mouth in terms of the work that they do. So I would really advocate for INGOs listening to this, think about your role as a convener, not just for your partner, but for other organizations in that ecosystem.
Yeah. Connector and ecosystem builder. How is that different from everything we discussed, particularly convener?
Convening is a subset of being a connector and ecosystem builder. We talk about ecosystems a lot in our work, and we take a systems approach to our advocacy and our research and all of our change agenda, really. Very, very briefly, most countries, there's a dynamic, vibrant constellation of actors. At community level, women's groups, youth groups, some of them are informal, some of them are formal, some of them are well-established, some of them are movements. But there's a lot of fragmentation within that ecosystem. Some of them don't have the opportunity to talk to each other. Some of them are rivals. Some of them are actually played off against each other by the way in which the international system pits funding, and organizes competitive calls for proposals. So the system itself, the ecosystem in those countries, particularly for civil society, is very fragmented. And what we say is, when you as an organization are working on a particular theme, think about the health of the ecosystem. Don't just think about the particular activity that you're doing or the particular partner you're supporting.
Okay.
Think about the health of the ecosystem that you're strengthening, whether it's education or water and sanitation or peace building or gender. Think about the network and the constellation of actors that could be should be your champions, because they believe in the same thing as you. And how can you strengthen the links between them? So it's about being the connective tissue between those organizations. Now, some of that is about being a convener, but not always. You can actually do it in other ways. You can have funding models, for example. You can run grant-making programs that actually intentionally build bridges between organizations. You can support coalition building. You can strengthen networks rather than individual organizations. So there's a lot of different ways in which you could be a connector and ecosystem builder. And I think all of those are, again, very, very underutilized. And there's a huge underinvestment in that across the sector, because we're still very siloed in the way that we work, both in terms of our partners or the projects.
Yeah. And then the last couple of ones, because I do want to get some questions on why we seem to be under investigating this role shift and what are internal organizational impediments to that. So advocate and amplifier, I think, is clear enough. Watchdog, fairly well known. Critical friend, Yes, I think sidekick. Anything about sidekick that you want to say? What does that look like?
I think for me, sidekick is the most important one, and we deliberately left it to the end because for us, it's a philosophy. It's a state of mind. We originally called this a accompanier, but actually we came across something called the Sidekick Manifesto. I'd encourage you to all have a look at that, your listeners or those who are watching this, a manifesto which really speaks to this idea of accompaniment and being a sidekick. Really, it's a philosophy. It's about saying we have been in the driving seat for the last 50 years when it comes to other people's development. And what we need to do is we need to step out of that role and become in the passenger seat. So we're still there on the journey with them. We're walking with them or we're driving with them, whichever analogy you want to use. But it is really a philosophical shift that then says we are now going to be sort of humble friends and sidekicks to you, to your efforts, and allow the space for them to be able to take the lead. So it really is a mindset shift, because most INGOs have built up their reputation of being the experts, and we're saying it's about time you stop talking like that, because you are squeezing out the expertise of others. And actually starving the system of kind of oxygen, because it's their ecosystem. So we've taken up a disproportionate space in that system in our pursuit of doing good. And so being a sidekick is that sort of fundamental shift we need to make, because we then start to see our role very differently. And of course, once you start doing that, you can then really start to challenge yourself about the role that you should play, rather than the role as an implementer or a grant manager.
Yes. Yes. Okay. I was going, but we're not, because we won't have time for this. I was going to ask you about a couple of sub roles, or maybe additive roles, that my frequent collaborator Barney Talek and I have written about in a blog on the International Civil Society Center site. But I'm not going to do it there. We simply won't have time to. I want to turn to some questions about. You and I seem to agree that the role shift, what is still an appropriate and legitimate and additive role that's actually needed in the world and in the ecosystem, and that Global South civil society welcomes. What's stopping NGOs from truly reconsidering these roles? If our premise of you and I is correct, what's stopping that? What are the underlying impediments and mindsets, and the internal organizational obstacles, you think, Dylan?
There are so many, Tosca, to be honest. I'll try and cover them as quickly as I can. The ones that we know, and I'm sure that there are others. First, I think there is a failure of imagination. INGOs still can't quite wrap their heads around the idea that they should exit out of their role and transition into other roles. And that failure of imagination is partly because how they have conceptualized success as implementation, delivery, service delivery, or grant management. And actually, anything else doesn't look like success. When actually what we should be doing is reconceptualizing what we mean by success. And actually, it's, success is not always about growing bigger, doing more, implementing more, but actually about thinking about the system, the ecosystem that we're leaving behind. So I think it's partly a failure of imagination. Partly it's around institutional inertia. We've been doing these things for the last 50 years, so let's keep on doing them. And of course, the need is there. When you look at it, the need is there. So you can see whether it's human suffering or poverty or human rights abuses, gender inequality, all of those things are there. And that, in our very simplistic equation, means that we then say, well, we are needed, rather than who are the people who are best placed to do this. So I think it's failure of imagination, institutional inertia. I do think there's a real problem still around structural racism, the neo-colonial attitudes. We still think we know best. We think others don't really know, and the sort of deficit thinking approach. So those communities can't be trusted with their money. We know best. We'll help them. We'll help lift them out of poverty. I think there's a real problem at a board level and a strategy level. I think boards still see themselves operating on a sort of almost a commercial model, where the only way we describe the impact of our work is by growth in numbers and expanding our reach rather than shrinking. And so boards are an impediment, and our strategies themselves are an impediment. because our strategies tend to then mirror this idea, this commercial idea that bigger is better, growth is the only thing. But I also think the sector, when we look at policymakers and funders, they also have an important role to play because they haven't yet pushed the sector to be different. There are signs. The donor statement on locally led development, for example, is one, and there are others. But donors are still happy to rely on the usual suspects, right?
Yes.
Their favored INGOs, their trusted INGOs to do the job.
Trusted favorite partners, etc.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Let me ask you one more internal obstacle, and for sure. And so this can be conceived as being pretty daunting, right, to tackle. But one thing that my collaborator Barney asked me to ask you is how about the impediment at fundraisers? So how do we raise, divert, or turn down resources in the shift? So for instance, fundraisers who still at face value, understandable, say, listen, we can much more easily seek funding for the old roles, but actually the organization needs to help them move away from these traditional fundraising asks.
You're right, although I would argue that fundraising is just a function of, or a consequence of, an organizational strategy and plans that have been set outside of the fundraiser's remit. So the fundraisers have fundraising targets. If those fundraising targets didn't exist, or actually we said that instead of quantity of funding, you look for quality of funding, which is really about unrestricted funding that you are then going to pass through to local organizations. Maybe fundraisers wouldn't feel that they're on this treadmill, this ongoing treadmill to raise ever greater amounts of funding. I think the problem lies actually not with the fundraisers, but with the organizational strategies and plans that still say, you have to raise this much money because that's how we're going to measure how successful you are. And it has to be more than you raised last year because that's the only way that we can know that we're doing a good job. And, if you think about even how we report on some of these things to the boards, most boards are happy when you see a 20% growth of our income because it means we're having a bigger impact, as if money is the proxy for impact. And I think that we've really got to start thinking differently about that. I talked recently in a blog that I wrote about a growing smaller strategy. The idea that actually, people think about growth as it's the North Star. Actually, let's grow smaller. Let's think intentionally about how we might shrink over time. And really, I'm talking about the very large multi-mandate organizations, the ones that have, $1 billion or $500 million.
Yeah.
Because there is a need. There is a need for those organizations to shrink. But I would also argue even the mid-sized INGOs also have that same request, or that same challenge to them, is how can we think about our impact in the world differently rather than just on growth?
Okay, two things that some people might challenge your point of view on, and I've heard people say this. So one is, but we have not gotten smaller, except when we were forced to through larger trends in funding, etc. But we are much more globally representative now. We are governed by affiliates and members and sections, etc. across the world. Our leadership and staff is truly globally representative now. It is no longer white people from the global north, etc. Those NGOs who said that's the route we have taken, and what's wrong with that? What would you say to them? My first ask.
Well, the first thing I would say is I think some of that is window dressing. It's a sort of facade to demonstrate that the global North INGOs are trying to change. And I'm not, by the way, trying to diminish the genuine efforts that are happening, because there are efforts. But I also see INGOs basically contorting themselves to persuade themselves and others that they are local, that they are now a local organization, because we have local staff. 80% of our staff or 90% of our staff are local. So surely we're a local organization, or surely it doesn't matter that that we are a large INGO based in that country because we're doing good work. Actually, all of these things, these sort of mental gymnastics that people are doing, really isn't helpful if we're talking about a transformation that is necessary. Because the reality is that if you are a community-based organization or a genuinely local organization, you look at those organizations and say, you take up the bulk of the funding that is available in my country. And that starves local organizations of that money. And local civil society has to lead in the efforts to lift themselves out of poverty or disadvantage or build a more peaceful world, not an organization that has come into that country. The 9 roles paper demonstrates that there is a role for INGOs, but I think we've really got to push back against the idea that if we tinker at the edges of the system or would make a few small tiny adjustments like the number of staff we have or that are from that country or the number of board members we have, we're suddenly a local organization. That is really rejected by almost every local organization that we've ever spoken to. And they also say, the power that comes with your brand, INGOs, your brand counts for everything. You can walk into a meeting with an embassy official and those local organizations can't. Even if you have 100% of the staff are local, you're still subordinate to a global strategy that is set outside the country. Yeah. So I think we've really got to be careful about how we, try not to justify our position, our existence by some metrics that really aren't transformational.
And what do you say? Another argument that I've heard said by the CEO of a very large global NGO, who said there's a place for both. So there have to be some really large global north founded INGOs because that will grow the pie for everybody. That person would say. And we need some actors in civil society who are at such a scale that they can deliver, right, in a highly efficient, kind of cost-effective per intervention, let's say, scale, because if we distribute it all through what is a very fragmented global civil society, we'll never get the kind of outcomes that we want. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd love to talk to that CEO. I think the first thing to say is that the idea that it grows the pie for everyone is, I think, nonsense. And I think it actually is proved by the evidence that's out there. So there's a report that's been recently released by the Global Fund for Community Foundations and Peace Direct was part of the research that shows that 90% of all funding for civil society from the global north goes to INGOs from those donor countries. So when we talk about the pie is 90% of the pie is eaten by INGOs from the global north. 10% goes to local organizations. So it doesn't expand the pie for local organizations. It just enables global north organizations to take a larger slice of the pie. In terms of the funding to local organizations and the fact that there are so many of them, you're absolutely right. And the CEO of that organization is absolutely right that it will take time for civil society to build up its scalability, because at the moment it's the 1,000 flowers blooming, right? Exactly. Then none of them are particularly tall flowers. They're just 1,000 flowers or 10,000.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that's because we've starved local civil society for the last 50 years. Why we're using the logic of the large number of small organizations to justify why we should be there, but we created that system in the first place. Which is quite a perverse argument, I think, because, if you look back at the last 50 years, INGOs have dominated, and therefore the money has, we have starved local organizations of the ability to grow tall and to be bigger. And until we do that, we can't use that argument against them. It feels pretty disingenuous. I think what we've got to do is we've got to step back and say, let's allow these organizations to thrive and to grow. And in order to do that, we have to step back a little bit. I do think INGOs will always have a role because in our paper, we say there will be global north donors who will want to support those organizations rather than directly funding local groups. And those 9 roles present very tangible value-added roles.
Exactly.
But we can't continue to justify implementation as we have done. And I think that's where I really worry that we are stuck because the donors still like their favorites. INGOs don't want to change. The boards have no desire to really push for this. And so what we'll do is we'll look back and say, this whole effort at transforming the sector has failed.
Yeah. God, I'm tempted to keep prodding on this a little bit, but we're just running out of time. So one more question. You've talked already about the role of boards. I want to talk about, and you mentioned size. So when I say in some public fora, I say the future roles that I see, and again, your piece was very helpful in articulating, and I have maybe a few other thoughts about additional roles, but we won't go into that now. But I see a sector and I see individual organizations that are much smaller in size. They just have to be. And when I say that, I'll say two more things. The staff will look differently in every way, including competencies, right, than they are now. And it has to be accompanied by a different culture and mindset. When I say that, I get blank stares, especially on the size issue, which is where, of course, it really will hurt. Let's face it. What's your comment to those three dimensions?
You're right, Tosca. I say the same thing. The sector will be smaller. And by the way, that's a good thing, and that should be a measure of our success. I think, and I'll share a link with you after this podcast of something that I wrote about strategies. We've forgotten that we were supposed to do ourselves out of business.
Mm-hmm.
We've forgotten that actually a mark of our success should be that we are no longer needed because civil society can do it in those countries. And so if we go back to the basic principles, let's do ourselves out of business. Let's make sure that we are no longer needed. That will take time. We know that because we talk about the poly crisis. We talk about the rising levels of inequality in some countries. It will take time. And I don't think any global South actor is expecting all this to happen overnight because that's not realistic. But if we don't start planning for a reduction in the size of the sector, we will be inadvertently maintaining the status quo and maintaining the dominance of us over them. And that's not fair.
And it's not fair, but I think it is because we would like to have it both ways. And I don't think we can, meaning we can't. But because we don't want to talk about that thing, that elephant in the room, we keep kind of, your word, contorting ourselves in the other ways. I'm not saying that there is no value in some of the programmatic models and definitely shifting power, resources, etc., authority, decision rights, business models, but it's still not getting to the actual role thing.
Exactly.
And it just bugs the hell out of me. And I'm so glad that I got you to talk today on the show. Hopefully over time, and you are, in my view, very eloquent on these questions. So, but we have to bring it to a close now. So, important work, obviously, in my view, that Peace Direct is doing, and that you're doing as a spokesperson. Where can people learn more about Peace Direct, about its thought leadership on this topic and other topics, like you said, race and development, decolonizing aid, partnership, and what makes for a quality partnership in the paradigm that Peace Direct has chosen, etc., and about you?
Thanks, Tosca. Well, I would just encourage people to have a look at our website, peacedirect.org. All of our publications are there, but also to follow us on social media, particularly on LinkedIn, because we are, and on X, because we have a lot of our advocacy, and we promote a lot of our work through those. And we are trying to have a conversation with people about this. This is an ongoing conversation about the transformation of the sector. Whether you're a peace builder or not, this matters if you care about sort of international cooperation. So have a look at us online and follow us, because we'll be producing more resources this year as well.
Okay, super. Well, I've been so invigorated by this discussion. Thank you so much, Dylan, for your insights and for everything that Peace Direct does to keep what I call prodding the sector to say we need there is more, there is another layer of change that we need to tackle here. And thank you also, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, there are several other episodes in my podcast that tackle the topic of the need for sector level change, as well as big organizational change, shifting power, authority, decision rights, etc., on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org, with the number 5, as well as on the YouTube channel. And so with that, you will find many more resources but with that, I want to say, have a look at that website, subscribe to the email list so that you will know when this and other episodes will drop in the future, and you will always be the first to know about these things. With that, I am saying goodbye. This is Tosca. See you next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.